Yeah? Perfect. Okay, cool. So yeah, as Vanessa said, I'm Carolyn, and I work as a technical writer and a front-end developer in Berlin. And I'm here to talk to you about humanizing your documentation. And for the sake of this talk, documentation is defined as the information that describes products to its users. And this can mean anything from API references to getting started guides to anything in between. So I want to start off with a single question. Why do we even write documentation? Is it because our competitors have it? Or because someone told us to do it? Or is it because we really want the people using our software to achieve their goals? It should be the latter, but that's usually not the case. Writing documentation is often an afterthought. It's something that we just get done. But what if we gave our documentation the same time and consideration that we do the features we ship? Use case-driven documentation derives from the idea of goal-driven documentation, both of which were coined and made popular by Tyner Blaine in 2006. And it works like this. Put your user's goals at the focal point of your docs, instead of just describing interface elements from left to right. And a common way to illustrate this idea is a drill. So, if we approach documenting this drill the same way that most document software, we'll end up with something like this. How to adjust the speed, how to change the direction of the drill, how to change the drill bit. So now you know how to operate a drill, but you don't actually know how to accomplish anything with it. And these are known as reference documentation. They're information-oriented, they describe the machinery, and they try to always be accurate and complete. And while this type of documentation is certainly necessary, it could definitely use a more nurturing counterpart. So if we reshape our thinking just a bit and think about what it takes to do the job and not just use the tool, we could end up with something like this. How to drill a hole in a flat surface, whether it's wood or metal. How to select the right screw for fastening items. How to stir paint with your drill. Suddenly, the documentation is helping us achieve our goals. And these guides are goal-oriented. They show you how to solve a specific problem. And they're typically presented in a series of steps. But why is this approach successful? Well, to begin to understand that, we need to think back to that original question. Why even write docs? And perhaps more importantly, we need to consider, who are we writing documentation for? And the answer is surprisingly simple. Humans. So yeah, with the development of bots and AI, this answer could certainly change in the next couple of years. But for now, most software documentation is written with the idea that humans will read it. And humans need that guidance that documentation is meant to provide. That's why these same principles for the drill can also apply to our software. And we aren't writing documentation to teach someone how to work with our software, but rather we're teaching someone how to achieve their goals and solve their problems using our software. Now, let's apply this idea to something more applicable to our industry, say Slack. Slack is a cloud-based set of team collaboration tools, and because I know they have a developer portal and thorough documentation, I crawled their sites for examples. And here's what I found. As expected, they have those information-oriented reference docs that we talked about earlier. They teach us how to add a bot user to our Slack app, programming those bot users, and how to subscribe to event types with the Events API. That's nice, but maybe as a first-time Slack user, I'm not sure how or why I would need these features. So this is a screenshot from the exact same site, just a different page. Notice how they are not only giving us use cases, creating simple workflows, building bots, but they're also outlining what we can accomplish, creating a simple workflow by automating tasks like requests and approvals, or building a bot so we can talk with our users. And it points to that reference documentation that we saw in the previous slide. And now that we have an idea of what use case-driven documentation is, let's take a look at the outline. So when you develop a use case, you typically start with a goal. Then if you're using use case-driven development or something similar, the rest of your workflow should look something like this. You'll define the functional requirements, You'll design the product, and then you'll implement the feature. This is called a structured requirements approach. And with an approach like this, we've already solved half the problem, determining what to document. The thing is that what most documentation is doing is starting at this implementation phase. It's once you've already finished that feature, and this is okay, it works, the docs get done. But what a use case-driven approach is suggesting is that we start here at, you probably guessed it, the use case. And the beauty of this is that you can design your documentation simultaneously with the features that you're developing. And when we use this structured requirements approach, we have an established framework for defining the problems that our software will solve. And we also can articulate how people will solve these problems with use cases. And then these use cases define exactly what we should be documenting. But there's a problem with that approach. First, it requires a fundamental change in how our team tackles documentation. And that's not always possible. Also, it sounds more like this beautiful ideal instead of our, immediate reality. Also, those reference docs, the ones that describe what the software can do, those are why documentation has such a bad rep in this industry. They tend to be dry and really leave us wanting more. Personally, I know this feeling all too well, because even if I write technical content for a living, I still have a pretty unsatisfying relationship with documentation. About this time last year, and after 2 years of working in tech as a journalist or a writer, I decided to take the dive and learn to code. And I knew exactly what I wanted to focus on: JavaScript. But, okay, I don't know how you guys felt while you were learning, but it felt like to me every single day I was asking myself something like, what is going on? In my text editor, in my terminal, it didn't matter where I looked. I had no idea what was happening. Am I the only one who finds this confusing? Because I know there are a lot of people working in JavaScript, and they seem to be thriving, but not so much at the moment. And do people actually enjoy this? And will I ever think that programming things with JavaScript is fun? Spoiler alert, I got it together. It's pretty fun now. But it felt like in order to do the interesting things with JavaScript, you needed to know the advanced features. Not to mention all of the frameworks and toolings. It felt impossible to keep up. But the most detrimental part, I think, of my learning experience was the documentation I was finding. It was supposed to be fueling my learning, but it was actually stunting it for the most part. And more often than not, I felt really deflated after reading docs. And my questions, they're still left unanswered. And the thing is, I'm not alone in feeling like this. Documentation is one of the largest pain points for developers. Just search reading documentation on Twitter, and you'll see that most of the tweets are, let's say, not so positive. And here are some of my favorites, actually, that I found just within the last week. Hi, I was reading your documentation, and you described this data in 2 different ways. Which is correct? Thank you. The way it works is 3rd completely different description. Or this one. Nothing like spending a day reading a 137-page PDF for CMS documentation. Puts head down on desk and cries. I would cry too. And this is my personal favorite. Bad documentation is bad. And even after someone else asked this person, if there were no docs, would it be better? She still said, deep thoughts. Honestly, yes, because it would waste less of my time. So, people love to hate documentation. But I believe that's also on us, the people who write docs, because it seems like we hate them right back. Think about the term users. Laura Kalbag, a designer and accessibility advocate, explains this well. She says, I tend to not even refer to people as users. I refer to them just as the people who use things. She explains that this is because when we say user as a developer, we're separating ourselves. We turn the people who use our products into this faraway thing. And we don't necessarily think of them as someone who is just like us. And that's why as a technical writer at my job, I have needed to constantly remind our developers, or myself even, that we are writing for humans. And not just that, but we are writing for humans who don't even want to be reading what we're writing. Because people, as Vanessa mentioned, people don't enjoy reading technical documentation for the most part. People visit your documentation when they're frustrated. They're already mad, they're frustrated with your software, they're disappointed that they haven't been able to solve the problem on their own, and they're generally feeling pretty low. And that reality is not awesome, especially if you are someone who puts a lot of love and care and consideration into your documentation. But being aware of these negative feelings that your readers are experiencing is key, because these emotions frame the reader's perspective, and therefore they should shape the mood of our docs. So what were these issues that I had with the documentation I found? Well, I could put all of it into 3 categories. They were disorienting. The underlying structure was difficult to follow, and in some cases, the docs were not accessible, as in I literally couldn't read them because of the way they were programmed. They were alienating. So some documentation I read made me feel super isolated afterwards. There were words or concepts that were assumed knowledge, difficult syntax, and that were never explained, and not to mention the use of gendered or discriminatory language. And finally, they were just plain confusing. And it was clear that the developers working on these features I was reading the docs about had a huge depth of knowledge. But it wasn't exactly translating to me as a first-time or generally pretty new user. So now let's run through each of these one by one. I'll show you the problems with examples of what not to do, followed by some tools and role models that can help us do better. And all of the what not to do examples come from software documentation that's actually live on the internet. But I'm trying not to make too many enemies during this talk, so I've adapted some of them to go back to that drill example just to keep it anonymous. So let's start with disorienting. A big part of that, as I mentioned, was the poorly defined structure. And how we structure our documentation is really important because it shapes that learning journey for our user and the overall experience for our readers. And if the structure is not well defined, you lose control of how people interpret your work. Here's one of those not so great examples. And again, adapted for the drill. So here's the short story for getting up and running quickly with your drill. 1, read the documentation. 2, read the documentation. 3, remember that you were warned twice about reading documentation. Like, if I'm in the Getting Started guide, aren't I already reading the documentation? And it goes on after this to just list every command, optional or not, that's possible with this tool. And I specifically put a screenshot because I can't make this up. I cannot make up that someone just wrote this. And it's particularly bad because Getting Started guides or any sort of introductory materials are your first impression to potential users. So how can we combat this? A mindful structure. Whether it's just in one particular article or throughout your entire doc app in development, we want to have a clear and easy to follow structure. And when in doubt, especially for individual articles, I would aim for something like this. Talk about one specific feature. Use that kind of reference docs and explain what it really does. Go on to explain potential use cases that people could use this, or the best case scenario for people to use this. And finally, offer solutions then for tooling, integrations, etc. Because then you can kind of guide the reader into what to go to next. And this covers all of your bases. It has those information-oriented reference docs. It has the goal-oriented guides. And like I mentioned, it plugs where they should go next in their journey. The next big issue is unexpected errors. So have you ever read something that, I don't know, says something like, just run this snippet and you're good to go. But then when you run the code, you get a big fat error? Like, unfortunately, this is all too common. And when error messages do come up, a lot of times, they tend to look like this. We have lost connection to our server and disabled editing features. Please verify that you have internet access. Okay, this literally tells me nothing. All I know is that I need to check my connection, but I don't understand why my editing features are disabled. Will my changes still save? Did the connection go down? Is it mine? Is it theirs? I don't know. So we should consider and address common errors whenever we know them. And because this helps reassure your users that mistakes will happen, errors will happen, but it also provides options for troubleshooting. So when you're writing these error messages, try to explain what happened and why, and then tell the readers what to do next. So here's a better solution for our error mishap earlier. This tells you what happened, the fields are locked, why it happened, because of no internet connection, and its implications, so that you won't lose changes. It appears you aren't connected to the internet at the moment. The fields are temporarily locked, so you won't lose any important changes. Here's another example, and this is a screenshot from the Apple II Basic Programming Manual from, yes, the 1970s. It tackles the nuances of common user errors quite well, and they actually explain many of the syntax errors before they even have you start coding. And this example in particular also follows that three-step approach. It tells us what happened, you got a beep and the syntax error message, why it happened, you probably press return, and what to do next. It literally just says, for the time being, ignore this message, and that's perfectly fine. When we're formatting these error alerts, in a tutorial especially, Django Girls is a great resource to reference. They do a great job at scattering these types of notes throughout the tutorial, and the format is clear so that it enables them to be informative enough so if people are having errors, they know what to do, not to panic. And they're not so distracting, so if you're not having these errors, it's easy to kind of brush through them. All right, that's the last of the disoriented category, so let's move on to alienating. And the first thing that comes to mind with alienating is insensitive language. And this one can be tricky because across nationalities and personalities, insensitive language or wording or phrasing can mean a lot of different things. And in this case, we're mostly talking about gendered language, profanity, racial slurs, or anything that kind of falls under those lines. So some not so great examples. If the programmer wishes to uphold the invariant, he must satisfy the function's preconditions. As a woman in tech, I hate reading documentation like this because I already feel pretty ostracized in the community a lot of times, and having something like this shows me that this isn't for me. Or this one. In this guide, I will show you 3 main ways to hide your shit. First of all, profanity is probably not the way to go, and also it doesn't really tell me what it's doing. And both of these are relatively tame examples, but they show instances of this insensitive language. In both instances, they won't always, some people might find it funny, but a lot of people, it won't go over well in your community. So you can think before you type. Easier said than done, but a good rule to follow is when documenting code, don't make assumptions or make any implications about race, gender, religion, political orientation, or really anything else that isn't relevant to your product. Or you can have a linter do it for you. So this is Alex.js, and it And it catches insensitive and polarizing writing in your Markdown files and also suggests helpful alternatives. You can use it on the command line or as an integration with Atom, Sublime, VS Code, and even Slack. And it's also open source, so if you run into some words that you're like, hey, I don't know if I'm cool with this, but they're not catching it, you can feel free to contribute. I would also say you should still have an actual human being read over it, preferably someone who's not from your same nationality or demographic. But it's a good start. So here's that same sentence from earlier. But now AlexJS is helping us catch those words that might be better left out of our documentation. And on that note of words not to use, don't say simply, easily, easy, simple, just leave it out. James Harrison Fisher actually gave an entire talk at Write the Docs London about this very topic. At one point, he searched the word simply on GitHub, and he found over 92 million references in documentation on GitHub. And it's just not appropriate. For example, simply connect to the HTTP endpoint at api.mydrill.com. And that was it. So, okay, but we don't know how to do this. Or, this one, we simply start parsing an expression, and afterwards, if the next token is a colon, and the expression was a simple identifier node, then ... I don't know about you, but this doesn't sound so simple to me. And my solution for this? Don't use it. Just take the word out completely. Because really, after fixing bugs for hours, do you really want someone to say to you, like, but this was so easy? Respect people's time and people's progress, and just find another way to say it. Be more specific and figure out why you think it's simple. Try it maybe as an alternative being comparative. So X requires less typing than Y. Or even better, be absolute. 5 lines of code. The next issue that's alienating is bloated language, or these kind of overly complicated and robust prose. And, okay, I'm gonna take a sip of water before this next one. This approach will work for our specific use case, but we haven't achieved the objective of truly encapsulating the behavior in a reusable way. Now, every time we want the drill position for a different use case, we have to create a new component, i.e. essentially another drill with screw, that renders something specifically for that use case. That's a mouthful. That's a lot, and it's only 2 sentences. And it's difficult to read and difficult to comprehend. At least on the first try. So, an alternative is to use plain language. We want to choose our language intentionally when we're writing documentation, and using plain language is critical for a more inclusive documentation. But it can be difficult because, especially if you went to university, they really try to get that out of you because plain language is seen as a negative thing. But in reality, it's just allowing more people to understand and comprehend our work. And again, there is an app that can help you. So this is Hemingway Editor, and it is a tool to paste your text in, and it'll highlight problematic words or sentences for you, as well as offer suggestions. It's available as a text editor application, a web app, and even a linter. And so in the case of the example that we just had, it identified that the first sentence is hard to read. That's why it's highlighted in yellow. The second sentence is very hard to read, so it's in red. It highlights adverbs in blue because they're not necessary for what we're trying to say. And it also points out words that could have had a simpler alternative, so in this case, objective. And our sentence right now is a grade 12. And we want to get that down, and you want to stay around a maximum of grade 8 reading level. And never worry about a reading level being too low. Because as the amazing Ashley Bischoff once said, no one has ever complained about something being too easy to read. And now to the issue of it being confusing. Fortunately, out of the 3 issues, this one is actually the one that comes from a good place. So for instance, you're just in way too deep. So when you're working as a developer, it can be difficult to write documentation because you're so deep in that product and that specific feature that you're developing. So what often happens is that while you're writing documentation, you might be writing it as if you're talking to yourself or maybe one of your colleagues. But the problem is that new users, or really any user, won't have that same frame of reference that you do. And so any unexplained term or skipped step in a tutorial can destroy the learning journey for that reader and really put them off of your documentation. So it's important to keep in mind that everyone is a beginner at some point. And no matter how intuitive you think your product is or tool might be, everyone starts somewhere. What I've found to be effective is for you to go through the entire process from start to finish and talk out loud while you're doing it or explain the feature as you're going along. And have another colleague close by, preferably someone who's not working on the same project, take notes about what you are doing and identify those points that might be confusing or unclear to others. And another confusing issue that occurs frequently is that your product isn't a good fit for the person who's reading it. And that's okay. Just be transparent. So when you know there's a specific use case that maybe this tool or integration doesn't work well with, just say so. You'll save people a lot of headaches in the long run. And also in your introduction material, it helps to remind people to double check that this tool is appropriate for what they're trying to accomplish. The Reason documentation does this quite well. In their Converting from JS page, they emphasize that you should make sure that Reason is fitting your needs. And it also points out that you shouldn't unnecessarily thrash your colleagues over other languages and frameworks. But for the record, that's always unnecessary. You shouldn't do that. So I hope that I've given you a new tool to implement or maybe some new ways to update your documentation checklist. But before I get off the stage, I want to leave you with something that I learned during my time working at Contentful. And I believe that it's wise words that are applicable for anyone writing documentation. So when I read through Contentful's style guide, something immediately struck me. And at the very beginning, it says, "We aim for accuracy and consistency." Sure, this is the case for most docs. But what really got me is what came next. We also want to aim to be honest, helpful, and human. Honest in that we communicate the pros and cons of a solution because in doing so, we'll build trust. Helpful because we want our users to succeed. I mean, their success is ultimately our success. And we want to be human. We want it to feel familiar and approachable. Because after all, the people writing your docs are human too. Thank you.